Let's start with something that's easy to forget when you live in a country blessed by two oceans. Europe is still a continent under the shadow of war. Russia's invasion of Ukraine didn't just redraw borders, it ripped away illusions. Every NATO planner, every European leader suddenly had to confront a question that many had dodged for decades. If the tanks rolled west again, could Europe actually defend itself without the United States? Now, I'll tell you this, every meeting I've sat through in the Senate Armed Services Committee, every classified briefing, the pattern is the same. Europe still relies on American firepower, American logistics, American intelligence, and ultimately, American resolve. We are the backbone of NATO, and everyone knows it. But the question that's hanging heavier by the day is this: how long can Washington carry that weight alone? For years, NATO's deterrent posture has rested on two pillars. The first is our credibility, our word that an attack on one is an attack on all. The second is our capability, the planes, ships, and missiles, to make that promise real. Europe provides the first, America provides most of the second. And that imbalance, my friends, is the heart of today's tension. I've seen the numbers. Out of the alliance's total defense spending, roughly 68% still comes from the United States. That's not sustainable, not politically, not economically, and not morally fair to American taxpayers who are watching the price of groceries and gas rise while European governments struggle to hit even 2% of GDP on defense. But the problem runs deeper than money. It's about mindset. For decades after the Cold War, Europe demilitarized. The peace dividend became a habit. Armies shrank, weapons factories closed, and budgets shifted towards social programs. The assumption was that America would always be there, that we'd fly in from the Atlantic like cavalry over the ridge. And for a while, that was fine. But as we face new realities, China, Iran, cyber warfare, even our southern border, we're forced to admit the world's changed. Let's be honest, our patience has limits. Americans have spilled blood in Europe twice in the last century. We've kept troops stationed there for 80 years. We've paid for the shield that allowed European democracies to flourish, but a shield isn't meant to become a crutch. When I talk to voters back home in Texas, they ask, "Senator, why do we keep footing the bill for countries that are wealthier than we are?" And that's a fair question. Germany has the world's fourth largest economy, yet only recently began inching toward its defense targets. France, Italy, Spain each has advanced industries and global interests, yet most depend on the U.S. to fill the gaps. Here's the truth. NATO can't work if it becomes a one-sided partnership. Deterrence isn't charity, it's a shared insurance policy, and every member has to pay the premium. When only one ally consistently pays the full amount, the alliance starts to look less like a pact and more like a subsidy. Now, I'm not saying we abandon NATO, quite the opposite. NATO is one of the most successful military alliances in human history. It kept peace through the Cold War, brought freedom to the Baltics, integrated former Warsaw Pact nations, and created a security umbrella that allowed democracy to take root from Lisbon to Tallinn. That's worth defending. But if it's going to survive the 21st century, Europe has to do more than talk about strategic autonomy. It has to build it. What worries me most is complacency. The sense in some European capitals that the American political class, no matter who's president, will always come to the rescue. That's dangerous because there's a growing chorus in both parties here at home saying, no more blank checks. And if Europe doesn't hear that, they might be shocked when one day the check actually bounces. So as we open this conversation about NATO's future, I want to ground it in reality. Europe's dependence didn't happen overnight, and it won't end overnight. But it must end eventually. Because an alliance built on dependency isn't an alliance, it's an arrangement waiting to fail the moment one side hesitates. America's commitment to NATO has always been anchored in values, liberty, sovereignty, collective defense. Those principles remain, but the method, the balance of responsibility has to evolve. The threats are multiplying, resources are finite, and Washington's patience, while deep, isn't endless. In the next section, we're going to go back, look at how this imbalance started. Because to fix the future of NATO, we've got to understand the habits of its past. If you really want to understand where NATO's imbalance began, you have to go back to 1949, the birth of the alliance, The ink was barely dry on the North Atlantic Treaty when the architects of that pact understood one hard fact: Europe was exhausted. Its cities were in ruins, its treasuries drained, its armies shattered by 2 world wars in a single generation. The United States stepped in not only as protector, but as provider. The Marshall Plan rebuilt factories. The U.S. Air Force shielded skies, and American nuclear power became the ultimate deterrent. That arrangement worked because it made sense at the time. Europe was rebuilding. America was ascendant. But here's the irony. The stronger Europe became economically, the less it felt compelled to be strong militarily. Prosperity became the new defense strategy. And Washington, for decades, encouraged that imbalance because it suited our Cold War aims. We wanted a prosperous, peaceful Western Europe standing firm against the Soviet bloc, and we were willing to pay for that peace. I'll tell you this, no senator alive today doubts that NATO's deterrence worked. The Red Army never rolled into West Berlin, nuclear war never came, but when the Berlin Wall fell, the logic behind American overcommitment should have changed, and it didn't. Instead of winding down the imbalance, we institutionalized it. The U.S. stayed, paid, and played global cop, while Europe shrank its militaries, mothballed its tanks, and redirected billions toward welfare systems and green subsidies. Now, some will say, and I've heard this argument in Brussels, that Europe was exercising strategic restraint, that they were investing in diplomacy, not deterrence. Fine words, but in practice, it meant letting the American taxpayer cover the hard power costs while European leaders gave speeches about soft power. That's not strategy. That's wishful thinking wrapped in moral language. Let's be fair here. There were exceptions. The British Armed Forces, for decades, punched above their weight. Poland today spends more than 4% of GDP on defense, one of the few nations that truly gets it, living under the shadow of Kaliningrad. The Baltic states, small but fierce, know the stakes. They've seen Russian armor up close, but the big economies, Germany, Italy, Spain, lag behind. The imbalance isn't new, it's habitual. You know, I sometimes think of NATO's internal politics like a dinner table. America brings the main course, the carrier groups, the missile shields, the intelligence networks. Europe brings the wine diplomacy, declarations, committees. But every now and then you look around and realize the kitchen's empty, and that's a problem when the wolves are at the door. In the 1,990 seconds after the Soviet collapse, we expanded NATO eastward. I supported that, and I still do. Freedom-loving nations wanted in, and we had a moral duty to open that door. But expansion without rebalancing created strain. We added commitments faster than capabilities. We stretched our guarantees while Europe's military muscle continued to shrink. The alliance got broader, not deeper. Then came the wake-up calls. 9/11, Afghanistan, Crimea, and finally, 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Each time, NATO rallied rhetorically, but the heavy lifting logistics, air power, missiles came mostly from Washington. And let's be honest, folks, that can't go on forever. We're now at a crossroads that our founders never envisioned. The original NATO was built on necessity. The modern NATO risks running on inertia. The United States remains the indispensable ally, but indispensability is a dangerous role. It breeds dependency. And dependency, over time, corrodes partnership. Here's what history teaches us. Alliances survive not because they're sentimental, but because they're symmetrical, mutual benefit, mutual responsibility. Once that balance breaks, trust starts to erode, and you can already sense it, quiet frustration in Washington, quiet anxiety in Europe, both sides blaming the other for being too slow, too complacent, too focused on domestic politics. In my view, it's time to tell the truth with respect but with clarity. Europe's security is Europe's responsibility first. America can support, reinforce, and deter, but we cannot replace. Our role must be partner, not patron. When I talk about this, I don't do it as an isolationist. I believe deeply in the transatlantic alliance. But I also believe alliances, like any relationship, must evolve or die. Europe has to start seeing defense not as an American gift, but as a European duty. In the next section, we'll look at how that tension has been surfacing, the political tremors and public arguments that show just how fragile the current arrangement has become. From the 2025 NATO summit pledges to quiet discontent in both Congress and European parliaments, the fault lines are real, and they're widening. When people talk about NATO's current crisis of confidence, they tend to imagine some dramatic event, a treaty breaking, a war erupting, a president storming out of a summit. But the truth is quieter, more corrosive. It's fatigue on both sides of the Atlantic. You can feel it in the meetings, the communiques, the tone of the press conferences. Everyone says the right thing: solidarity, deterrence, unity. But behind those words lies a creeping sense that the partnership isn't balanced anymore. I'll give you an example. At the 2025 NATO summit in Washington, European leaders gathered to celebrate the alliance's 76th anniversary. There were big speeches, warm handshakes, and an agreement in principle that all members would aim for 5% of GDP in total security-related spending by 2035. That number sounds bold, almost revolutionary, but anyone who's spent time reading NATO spreadsheets knows the problem isn't promises, it's follow-through. Take Germany. Chancellor Scholz declared a Zeitenwende, a turning point, back in 2022 after Russia invaded Ukraine. Billions were pledged to rebuild the Bundeswehr, to modernize, to restore deterrence. And yet, 3 years later, half the procurement contracts are still stuck in committees. Soldiers are training with outdated equipment, tanks await spare parts, and German voters, weary of inflation and energy costs, are losing patience with defense spending. It's déjà vu all over again. Now, let's look across the Atlantic. Here in Washington, that frustration is palpable in both parties. I've spoken with colleagues who are tired of seeing U.S. troops permanently deployed across Europe, while some of our own bases back home need modernization. They're tired of appropriations, bills that quietly subsidize European defense industries through joint procurement programs. And they're asking legitimately, what does America actually get in return? And it's not just the money, it's the mindset. The United States carries the strategic load, the nuclear deterrent, the long-range precision strike capability, the satellite intelligence, the cyber backbone. Meanwhile, many European militaries have become boutique forces, excellent in niche operations, but incapable of sustained combat without U.S. lift and logistics. The gap is structural, not temporary. Now, some of my friends in Europe push back. They say, Senator Cruz, we are stepping up. Look at Poland, look at Finland, look at the Czech Republic. We're buying Abrams tanks, Patriots, F-35 seconds. And they're right, some nations are serious. But here's the irony. Most of that stepping up still depends on American industry. The weapons, the parts, the software all made in the United States. Europe isn't building its own defense base, it's renting ours. That's not autonomy, that's dependency under a new label. I'll tell you what keeps me up at night. If Washington ever turns inward, and I mean truly inward, if a fiscal crisis or a political shock forces us to retrench, could Europe hold the line on its own? The answer today is no. And that's not my opinion. That's the consensus of every serious analyst at NATO HQ. Without American enablers, NATO's response time, air dominance, and missile defense all drop by more than half. Half. That's not an alliance built for resilience. That's one built on borrowed strength. Let's be honest. We've reached a point where European security has become an American domestic issue. Our voters, our budgets, our politics dictate what happens in Warsaw, in Vilnius, in Berlin. That's not healthy for anyone. NATO was meant to be collective, not custodial. And then there's the politics of perception. The last few years, European commentators have fretted endlessly about the next U.S. election. They talk as if NATO's survival depends on who wins the White House. That tells you everything you need to know. A truly balanced alliance wouldn't live or die by one country's political cycle, but today it does. Let me add this. Leadership doesn't mean doing everything alone. It means empowering others to lead responsibly. Washington's role should be to set expectations, not carry burdens indefinitely. We can't keep writing defense checks to cover political indecision in Berlin or Paris. The time for polite reminders is past. It's time for enforceable commitments, real consequences for nations that treat NATO as an insurance policy they never intend to pay into. The cracks are visible. France talks openly about European strategic autonomy. Hungary flirts with Moscow. Turkey plays both sides. And in the background, Russia keeps testing NATO's unity with cyber attacks. with disinformation, with minor incursions designed to probe our will. That's how great power competition works now. It's not tanks across borders, it's pressure applied at the seams of alliance fatigue. If we don't address those seams now decisively, we risk something far worse than a dramatic collapse. We risk a slow decay of credibility, the kind that invites miscalculation, and history tells us that miscalculation, not malice, is what usually starts wars. In the next section, I'll dive into that new 5% by 2035, pledge what it really means, how realistic it is, and why it might be NATO's last chance to prove that Europe is serious about carrying its share of the load. When NATO leaders announced the new 5% by 2035 defense commitment, the headlines made it sound like a revolution, the moment Europe finally took responsibility for its own security. But as I looked over the details, I found myself asking a simple lawyer's question. What does that actually mean? Now, on paper, it sounds straightforward by 2035. All NATO members pledge to devote 5% of GDP to security-related spending, half on core defense, half on supporting sectors like cyber, intelligence, and industrial base. It's a broad definition, and that's the first warning sign, because broad definitions are how politicians dodge accountability. If you can count research subsidies, cybersecurity grants, and industrial green defense transitions as part of the total, suddenly everyone can claim compliance without actually buying more tanks or training more soldiers. Let's remember the history here. NATO's original benchmark, the famous 2%, was set in 2006, reaffirmed in 2014 after Crimea. Back then, only 3 allies met it. Today, 2 decades later, fewer than half still do. So forgive me if I don't take another pledge at face value. Promises don't deter, aggression, power does. Here's what I see as the core problem. Europe is still trying to build a security policy that's politically comfortable rather than militarily credible. It's easy to hold a summit, issue a communique, and declare unity. It's much harder to spend real money on heavy industry, on hard power, on capabilities that don't win votes but do win wars. And let's be clear, this 5% number didn't come out of thin air. It was a compromise pushed by the United States, tempered by European negotiators who wanted room for interpretation. It reflects what diplomats call strategic elasticity. I call it wiggle room. And wiggle room is what gets you caught flat-footed when crises come. Now, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. Some nations are treating this seriously. Poland is already north of 4%. The Baltic states are pushing hard. The UK is increasing defense production in partnership with the US and Australia under AUKUS-style agreements. Finland, NATO's newest member, is building readiness like it means it. Those are real commitments backed by real spending. But for many others, the pledge feels like political theater. Germany is still debating whether its special fund for defense should be extended beyond 2027. Italy's parliament is split between fiscal restraint and NATO obligations. Spain's defense industry is constrained by bureaucracy. And France, while militarily capable, often prefers to emphasize European strategic sovereignty, which in practice means limiting American influence rather than increasing European capacity. So what happens if this 5% goal turns out to be another paper promise? I'll tell you, the credibility of NATO itself suffers. Because in an alliance, the gap between rhetoric and reality isn't just embarrassing, it's dangerous. Adversaries watch those gaps, they study them. Moscow and Beijing both have intelligence units dedicated to analyzing whether NATO's words match its deeds. Every broken pledge is a signal that deterrence can be tested. You and I both know deterrence is a psychological game as much as a military one. If your adversary believes you'll act, they won't risk confrontation. If they think you're bluffing, they'll push. That's what Putin did in 2014 and again in 2022. It's what Xi is watching in the Pacific right now. The real question is this: does Europe actually believe it's at war? Not a shooting war, perhaps, but a long-term struggle for security, energy, and influence. Because if you don't believe you're in a fight, you'll never fight to win. And from what I see in too many European capitals, the political class still thinks of defense as optional, something to revisit after the next election, after the next budget cycle. Meanwhile, Russia and China don't wait for election calendars. Here's what I'd argue. If Europe wants Washington's patience, it must earn it through tangible action, not by 2035, but now. That means meeting and exceeding 2% within the next 2 years. That means funding domestic production lines for ammunition and missiles. That means training conscripts, reinforcing borders, and building cyber resilience that doesn't rely on American cloud servers. I say this not to scold our allies, but to remind them of the stakes. NATO is not a welfare program for defense. It's a contract of trust. And right now, too many signatures on that contract are written in invisible ink. This 5% pledge could be the start of a renaissance if it's backed by will, but if it's just another exercise in optics, it'll go down as the moment when the alliance mistook paperwork for power. In the next section, I want to turn to Europe's efforts at defense autonomy, the dream of a European pillar within NATO. It's a noble goal in theory. In practice, it raises a question that's central to this whole debate. Can Europe ever be strategically independent without being strategically divided? Every few years, someone in Brussels dusts off an old phrase and gives it new life: strategic autonomy. It sounds bold, almost heroic, a Europe able to defend itself, speak with one voice, and act without waiting for Washington's approval. Presidents and prime ministers love that line, but when you strip away the slogans and look at the substance, the picture gets complicated fast. Let's be honest about where this idea came from. The European project was born from the ashes of 2 world wars, a political union meant to make conflict impossible through integration. The dream of autonomy was always lurking beneath it. Someday, Europe would be strong enough, unified enough to manage its own defense. The trouble is, integration has moved faster in trade and regulation than in tanks and artillery. It's much easier to harmonize cheese standards than missile systems. After Brexit, the EU lost its single most militarily capable member. France has a nuclear deterrent, yes, but limited conventional reach. Germany has economic power, but military hesitation. The rest of the continent has pockets of excellence, Czech arms manufacturing, Polish armor divisions, Nordic cyber units, but no coherent command structure. So when European leaders talk about autonomy, what they really mean is coordination, and even that has proven elusive. I've read the white papers and attended the briefings. The European Defense Fund, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, the Strategic Compass, all worthy initiatives on paper, but they move at a bureaucratic pace, not a wartime one. They speak the language of frameworks and funding, not of readiness and rapid response. Meanwhile, Russia, China, and Iran operate on the logic of opportunity. Move fast, exploit gaps, strike when the other side is still consulting its committees. Here's the reality. NATO works because it's built for speed. A clear chain of command, an integrated structure, a single standard for interoperability. Europe's autonomous efforts, by contrast, often create duplication rather than strength. The French lead one task force, the Germans fund another, the EU Commission launches a third. The result is fragmentation, not unity. I'll tell you a story that stuck with me. A U.S. general, frustrated after an EU defense meeting, told me, "Senator, the Europeans want to build their own plane, but they still need us to refuel it." That's the problem in a nutshell. Europe wants independence, but keeps choosing dependence in practice on American lift, American ISR, American deterrence. Now, don't get me wrong. I want Europe to be strong. I want it to build the capacity to fight and win without calling Washington every time there's a crisis. A robust European pillar would make NATO stronger, not weaker if it's built on real capabilities. But I'm wary when autonomy becomes code for distance from the United States, because that's not strength, that's symbolism. France's President Macron likes to talk about Europe as a third pole in global affairs, not subordinate to the U.S., not aligned with China. It's an appealing vision for European pride. But geopolitics isn't a beauty contest. It's a balance of power. If Europe drifts too far from Washington, it doesn't become independent, it becomes vulnerable. The vacuum doesn't stay empty. It gets filled by Moscow and Beijing. What I find encouraging, though, is the quiet realism emerging in places like Poland, Finland, and the Baltics. They've learned the hard way that autonomy means nothing without hard power. These nations are building, training, and buying often from American suppliers, yes, but with urgency. They understand that security isn't about symbolism, it's about deterrence that an adversary can feel. And this brings us back to Washington's role. America should welcome a stronger, more capable Europe, not fear it. The problem isn't Europe's ambition to defend itself. The problem is its tendency to treat autonomy as a philosophical goal instead of an operational one. If Europe wants to lead, it must first be able to fight. There's also the industrial side. Europe's defense manufacturers are starting to wake up, expanding production lines, reopening dormant factories. But the supply chains still run through American technology, from radar systems to semiconductors. That's not a weakness per se, but it underscores how integrated transatlantic security really is. Full separation would be an illusion. Let's be honest. European strategic autonomy without American support would be like a body without a heartbeat. You can design the skeleton, build the muscles, but without the pulse, the coordination, the intelligence, the nuclear deterrent, it won't move. So the task before NATO now isn't to choose between dependence and independence. It's to build interdependence that's sustainable, balanced, and credible. Europe must contribute more, and America must allow it space to do so. That's how alliances mature, not through romantic slogans, but through shared responsibility. In the next section, we'll face the hard truth about what's holding Europe back, the internal constraints, political divisions, and economic pressures that make all these goals sound noble but remain painfully slow in reality. Because until we understand those obstacles, strategic autonomy will stay what it's been for decades, an aspiration in search of an army. If you've ever sat through a NATO budget meeting, you know what inertia sounds like. It's polite, deliberate, and utterly paralyzing. Every country agrees that defense is important, but when the time comes to pay for it, everyone looks at someone else. That right there is Europe's biggest obstacle. Not ignorance, not lack of resources, but the inability to act decisively in a system built on consensus and comfort. Let's start with the politics. Most European governments are coalitions, fragile ones. Defense spending is rarely a vote winner. It's often a political liability. You have green parties opposing rearmament, left-wing parties arguing that welfare must come first, and centrist parties trying to hold the middle while inflation eats away at every new euro allocated to defense. Even leaders who understand the threat, and many do face parliaments where every increase in military spending feels like a political suicide note. Germany is the clearest example. It's the economic engine of Europe, but its political DNA is pacifist. Understandably so, history casts a long shadow, but that history has also become a kind of psychological cage. The German public still sees military strength as something dangerous rather than necessary, and when the electorate won't move, neither will the politicians. So even after declaring a turning point, Berlin moves cautiously, almost reluctantly, as though rebuilding its defense capacity were a moral embarrassment rather than a strategic imperative. Then there's the economic reality. Europe's social systems are generous pensions, health care, energy subsidies. Those programs are politically untouchable. Defense spending competes directly with them. And as energy prices rise and aging populations demand more from their governments, the fiscal room for rearmament gets smaller, not larger. It's not that Europe can't afford defense. It's that it's chosen to prioritize comfort over security for so long that the gears have rusted. Add to that the industrial bottleneck. When the war in Ukraine began, Europe discovered an uncomfortable truth. It couldn't even produce enough artillery shells to sustain a modern war. Factories that once made munitions had been converted to civilian use decades ago. Bureaucratic red tape, environmental restrictions, and fragmented procurement rules made it nearly impossible to scale up quickly. It took 2 years just to agree on joint ammunition production, and even now, deliveries lag behind targets. And let's not forget the geography of complacency. Nations closest to Russia, Poland, Finland, the Baltics take defense seriously because they live next to the fire. But as you move west, the urgency fades. In Madrid, in Lisbon, even in Rome, the war feels distant. That's the curse of peace. The further you are from the front, the less real the danger feels. Now, some will argue that Europe is simply slow by design, that consensus ensures legitimacy, but security doesn't wait for consensus. Deterrence depends on speed, on credibility, on the ability to act before the threat arrives. When every procurement contract takes years, Every deployment requires approval from half a dozen committees, and every strategic decision must pass through layers of EU bureaucracy. The result isn't collective strength, it's collective hesitation. Here's what I find ironic. The European Union can move mountains when it wants to. Just look at how quickly it imposed sanctions after Russia's invasion, or how it unified on energy diversification. But when it comes to defense, that urgency evaporates. Why? Because for decades, Europeans assumed they didn't need to be fast. America would be fast for them. We'd deploy, we'd fly in, we'd take the heat while the deliberations continued. And that habit, my friends, is what's killing NATO's credibility today. The other constraint is psychological. After 75 years of relying on the American umbrella, Europe has lost the habit of thinking strategically. Defense debates often sound moral, not martial, full of ideals, short on logistics. Many European policymakers talk about peace diplomacy while Russia is bombing power stations and kidnapping children in Ukraine. That disconnect between rhetoric and reality is dangerous because it signals weakness to adversaries who understand only strength. Let me put it plainly, the biggest threat to NATO right now isn't Russia's next move or America's next election, it's Europe's inability to take itself seriously. Until that changes, Washington will keep carrying the lion's share, and resentment will keep growing on both sides of the Atlantic. Still, I don't believe it's hopeless. The tools are there, the money exists, the talent and technology are world-class. What's missing is urgency, that sense of danger that drives innovation and sacrifice. The United States can't manufacture that for Europe. It has to come from within. In the next section, we'll talk about Washington's patience, why it's running thin, what drives it politically, and how both the left and the right are starting to rethink America's role in NATO. Because make no mistake, the debate here at home will shape the alliance's future as much as anything happening in Brussels or Berlin. I'll be honest with you, Washington's patience with Europe didn't evaporate overnight. It's been wearing down slowly, like an old rope under constant strain. For decades, we carried the heaviest load in NATO without complaint because it served our national interest. It kept peace in Europe, contained the Soviet Union, and projected American influence across the world. But now, in 2025, the calculation is shifting not because America has stopped caring about Europe, but because the world has changed around us. You can feel that fatigue in Congress. I see it in committee hearings. I hear it in private conversations. Members from both parties, Republicans and Democrats, are starting to ask the same question: what exactly are we getting in return? When we send troops, when we write checks, when we underwrite Europe's security, are we strengthening an ally or enabling a dependency? And that's not an isolationist sentiment, it's a recognition of limits. Let's face facts. The United States is juggling more commitments than ever before. We're deterring China in the Pacific, containing Iran in the Middle East, managing a border crisis at home, and funding a proxy war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, our national debt just crossed $36 trillion. Every time we authorize another aid package or deployment, we're borrowing against the future. That's not sustainable, not politically, not economically, not strategically. And that's why this question of patience matters. The American people, hardworking men and women who pay the taxes that fund our defense budget, are watching. They see European nations with universal health care, subsidized education, and early retirement ages, yet still asking Washington to foot the bill for tanks and ammunition. That disconnect doesn't sit well in Texas or Ohio or anywhere else where folks work long hours and wonder why their money is defending countries richer than some of our own states. Now, I want to be crystal clear here. I'm not arguing for abandoning NATO. I believe in alliances when they're mutual. What I'm arguing for is accountability. Because alliances without accountability become entitlements, and entitlements eventually breed resentment. It's worth noting, too, that this frustration isn't confined to one political party. Under President Trump, the rhetoric was blunt: pay your fair share or we'll reconsider. Under President Biden, the tone softened, but the policy hasn't changed much. Even in this administration, you can see quiet signals that the U.S. expects Europe to take more initiative, fewer long-term troop deployments, more emphasis on local training, and growing pressure for defense industrial cooperation rather than dependence. That's not a partisan issue anymore, it's a national one. Republicans see it through the lens of fiscal restraint and sovereignty. Democrats see it through the lens of sustainability and global balance. But both sides agree. The United States cannot keep carrying NATO indefinitely. Let me tell you what keeps policymakers awake at night. It's not that Europe will fail to defend itself, it's that it won't even try hard enough until it's too late. History has a cruel way of punishing hesitation. In 1939, democracies waited until the storm was already overhead. In 2014, they treated Crimea as a regional hiccup. We can't afford another sleepwalk moment, not with Russia rearming and China watching every move. Washington's patience is finite because we have choices to make. We can either invest our energy where allies invest theirs, or we can keep pouring resources into a partnership that isn't keeping pace. And that's not bitterness, it's realism. When American voters start seeing their highways crumble, their border chaotic, and their kids struggling to afford housing, it's hard to explain why billions are still flowing to countries that won't meet defense commitments. But here's the deeper issue, trust. If America ever doubts that its allies would fight alongside us with equal resolve, the entire logic of deterrence collapses. Because deterrence isn't about hardware, it's about credibility. The enemy doesn't ask how many tanks you have, they ask whether you'll use them. And right now, too many in Washington doubt Europe's will to act decisively if things turn ugly. That doubt is corrosive. So the conversation we're having now in think tanks, in Congress, in the Pentagon isn't about withdrawal, it's about recalibration. What should America's role in NATO be in a multipolar world? Should we continue to guarantee European peace indefinitely? Or should we shift to a model where Europe becomes the first responder and America the strategic reserve, the shield behind the shield? That's a debate worth having because it forces everyone to be honest about their responsibilities. NATO was never meant to be a lifetime subsidy. It was meant to be a partnership of equals defending shared civilization. The principle hasn't changed, but the balance must. In the next section, I'll walk through what the future could actually look like. 3 possible scenarios for NATO over the next decade. 1 optimistic, 1 middling, 1 grim. And we'll talk about what each would mean for the United States, for Europe, and for the stability of the free world. When you look ahead to NATO's future, it's tempting to imagine a single clear path, either a revival or a decline, but reality rarely deals in absolutes. What lies ahead for the alliance will depend on choices, political, financial, moral, made by both sides of the Atlantic over the next decade. And as I see it, there are 3 scenarios on the horizon. 1 gives us renewed strength, 1 traps us in stagnation, and 1 leads to something far worse. Let's start with the best case, the revitalization scenario. In this version, Europe finally wakes up to the danger. The war in Ukraine, the pressure from Russia, the uncertainty about America's future political direction, all of it becomes a catalyst for true reform. Defense spending rises not just on paper, but in practice. European factories hum again. Countries like Germany and Italy rebuild serious militaries. The European Union streamlines procurement, harmonizes logistics, and ties defense integration directly to NATO interoperability instead of competing with it. In that scenario, America doesn't retreat, we reorient. We stay present as the strategic anchor, but we allow Europe to carry more of the day-to-day burden. Our forces shift toward rapid reinforcement instead of permanent occupation. We maintain our nuclear deterrent and global command structure, but no longer serve as the alliance's first responder to every crisis. That kind of balanced NATO would be stronger, not weaker, a truly transatlantic partnership rooted in shared responsibility. And it would send an unmistakable signal to adversaries. The West can adapt, and it's not fading. Now, the middle path, the stagnation scenario. This one's easy to imagine because we're living parts of it already. Europe increases spending modestly, enough to claim progress, but not enough to change outcomes. The U.S. remains deeply involved out of necessity, but increasingly frustrated. NATO holds summits, issues communiques, and launches new initiatives with great fanfare, yet behind the curtain, readiness still lags. The alliance survives, but its deterrence erodes slowly, like rust on steel. In that middle world, Washington's politics grow more divided. One administration invests in Europe, the next questions the cost. European governments oscillate between ambition and complacency, NATO becomes less about strategy and more about symbolism, a diplomatic ritual that provides comfort but little confidence. And that's a dangerous illusion, because adversaries test not rhetoric but resolve. Then there's the third scenario, the one we pray we never see. Call it the fracture scenario. In this version, Europe continues to underinvest while U.S. domestic politics turn sharply inward. The alliance's credibility collapses under the weight of unmet expectations. One flashpoint, maybe a cyber attack on a Baltic power grid, maybe a skirmish near Kaliningrad triggers a crisis. NATO hesitates, divided over response thresholds. Washington delays, European capitals bicker, and Moscow seizes the gap to achieve a limited fait accompli. Even if no full-scale war follows, the damage would be profound. NATO's Article 5 guarantee an attack on one is an attack on all would be seen as optional. That perception alone could unravel 75 years of deterrence in a single week. You can rebuild tanks and factories, but you can't easily rebuild credibility once it's lost. Now, I know these are simplified models. Reality will probably mix elements of all three. But the direction we move depends on choices being made right now in budgets and ballots, in parliaments and Congress. Do we double down on collective strength or drift toward quiet separation? Do we demand results or accept excuses? The answers will define whether NATO's centennial in 2049 is a celebration or an autopsy. I believe renewal is still possible. The alliance has faced worse crises before. It survived Suez, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and even the chaos of the post-Cold War expansion. What's kept it alive isn't bureaucracy or money. It's belief, the conviction that free nations stand stronger together than they do apart. That principle hasn't expired, but it needs fuel, and that fuel is willpower. For the United States, renewal means setting conditions, not ultimatums. We should say clearly, we'll remain committed, but the burden must shift. For Europe, renewal means courage, political courage to tell voters the truth. Security isn't free, and dependence is a choice. Every euro not spent on defense today risks being spent on reconstruction tomorrow. If NATO chooses the revitalization path, the next decade could mark its rebirth, a model of democratic resilience in a multipolar world. But if we drift into complacency, the slow decay will be almost invisible until it's too late. Alliances don't collapse with explosions, they fade in silence. In the next section, we'll talk about what all this means beyond Europe, for our allies in Asia, for Ukraine's future, and for the broader balance of the free world. Because make no mistake, how NATO evolves will shape not only transatlantic security, but global deterrence against authoritarian power everywhere. When you think about NATO's role in the world, it's easy to see it as a European story. But in truth, the alliance is now a global hinge. What happens inside NATO's borders affects deterrence far beyond them, from the South China Sea to the Persian Gulf. That's why the future of NATO isn't just a question for Brussels or Washington. It's a question for every democracy that relies on the stability of a rules-based order. Let's start with Ukraine. That war isn't just about territory, it's about credibility. When NATO supports Kyiv, we're not simply helping a sovereign nation resist aggression. We're proving that aggression doesn't pay. But here's the challenge. The longer that war drags on, the more strain it places on NATO's cohesion. America has provided most of the high-end systems, HIMARS, Patriots, F-16 training, advanced munitions. Europe, meanwhile, has often struggled to match that intensity, despite being geographically closer and directly threatened. That imbalance fuels resentment in Washington and dependency in Europe, and it sends a mixed message to Moscow. Because Vladimir Putin doesn't just watch the battlefield, he watches budgets, speeches, and votes. If he senses hesitation, he'll exploit it. If he senses exhaustion, he'll wait us out. The only language Putin understands is resolve, and NATO's ability to project that resolve depends on both halves of the alliance standing firm together. But the implications go far beyond Ukraine. In Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party is studying NATO like a textbook. They're analyzing whether Western alliances hold under pressure or fracture when tested. They're measuring our timelines, our debates, our divisions. Taiwan, the Philippines, Japan, they all take cues from how NATO handles aggression. If deterrence fails in Europe, It emboldens authoritarian regimes everywhere. The world is watching not what we say, but what we sustain. Then there's the Middle East. Iran's destabilizing actions, from its proxy militias to its nuclear ambitions, test the broader Western security umbrella. When NATO hesitates or appears distracted, Tehran interprets that as permission. Deterrence doesn't work in compartments. It's holistic. Weakness in one region echoes in another. So what does this mean for America's allies globally? It means that NATO's credibility is no longer regional insurance, it's global currency. If the alliance proves it can adapt, it will strengthen every partnership we have, from AUKUS to the Quad. But if it falters, it will erode faith in collective defense everywhere. The world's democracies, from Seoul to Stockholm, depend on the idea that when free nations promise solidarity, they mean it. Now, let's talk about Ukraine's long-term place in all this. Eventually, NATO must decide whether Kyiv joins the alliance or remains perpetually at its doorstep. That's a moral and strategic dilemma. On one hand, Ukraine has earned its seat through courage and sacrifice. On the other, NATO can't admit a member currently in active war without risking direct confrontation with Russia. But the decision can't be deferred forever. A gray zone between membership and exclusion is exactly where wars metastasize. I'll tell you what I think. NATO needs a phased approach, integrate Ukraine's military systems and intelligence networks now, formalize political membership once the shooting stops. That's how you balance deterrence with prudence, because ambiguity is no longer sustainable. The clearer NATO's message, the safer Europe becomes. Beyond Ukraine, the alliance has to think globally in ways it never did before. Cyber warfare, space security, artificial intelligence, these are not traditional battlefields, but they're becoming the new front lines. China and Russia are coordinating cyber operations, testing satellite resilience, and probing Western systems every single day. NATO's Article 5 must evolve to include those domains, or the alliance risks fighting 21st century wars with 20th century tools. And let's not forget the human dimension, the moral purpose that gives this alliance its soul. NATO isn't just a military pact, it's a statement of civilization. It says that free nations will stand together, that tyranny will not advance unopposed, that sovereignty and liberty are worth defending. That's what binds an American farmer in Iowa to a soldier in Estonia. That's what keeps the lights of democracy burning when the world grows dark. The next decade will test whether we still believe those principles enough to act on them. The threats we face, autocracy, cyber warfare, disinformation, are modern, but the question is ancient. Will free people stand together, or will they drift apart under pressure? In the next section, our final one, I'll bring this home. We'll talk about the principles that should guide America's relationship with NATO going forward, what I believe Washington must insist upon, and how this alliance can be renewed, not just as a treaty, but as a test of will. Because at the end of the day, NATO's survival won't depend on weapons or budgets alone. It'll depend on whether we still believe in the cause of freedom itself. When I think about NATO's future, I don't see it as a question of geography or even power. I see it as a question of faith. Faith in our word, faith in our allies, faith that the civilization we built brick by brick over centuries is still worth defending. Because make no mistake, that's what this alliance is really about. NATO isn't just a military arrangement, it's a moral covenant, a promise that liberty is not negotiable. But here's the truth, that too few leaders are willing to say out loud, if NATO is to survive another 75 years, it must change. Not in purpose, but in posture. Not in ideals, but in execution. The alliance of 2025 cannot operate like the alliance of 1955. The threats have multiplied, the balance of power has shifted, and the American public rightfully is asking for accountability. So what must guide us? I believe there are three principles that should be non-negotiable. First, Europe must carry its share. That doesn't mean a percentage on paper. It means capability in practice. A Europe that can defend itself is not a threat to the United States. It's a blessing because it allows America to remain engaged globally without being overextended regionally. The measure of alliance maturity isn't how loudly partners praise each other at summits. It's how evenly they shoulder the load when the shooting starts. Second, America must lead with clarity, not charity. Our commitment to NATO should be firm but conditional, conditional on accountability, transparency, and measurable progress. Leadership doesn't mean writing blank checks. It means setting expectations and enforcing them. We can no longer afford to confuse generosity with strength. Our power is most respected when it's used with purpose. Third, the alliance must remember why it exists. NATO was never meant to be a bureaucracy or a welfare program. It was meant to be a shield for free nations, a deterrent rooted in courage. If that spirit fades, no amount of budgets or bullet points will save it. But if that spirit endures, if we still believe that freedom is sacred and that tyranny must be resisted, then NATO's best days could still lie ahead. I'll tell you this, I don't buy the idea that the West is finished. I don't believe that decadence or fatigue will defeat us. We've faced down empires before, from the Soviet Union to the terrorists of the Middle East, and we did it because ordinary men and women decided that freedom was worth the price. That conviction hasn't vanished. It's just waiting to be reawakened. Washington's patience, yes, has limits, but America's resolve when the cause just runs deeper than any limit, and that's what I want our European friends to remember. We'll stand by you, but we need you to stand tall beside us, because partnerships built on equality last longer than those built on dependency. When I look at the world today, the gray zone warfare, the cyber attacks, the propaganda, the creeping cynicism, I see echoes of the old battles fought by generations before us. They weren't just fighting armies, they were fighting apathy. The belief that freedom could defend itself. It never could. It never will. So as we look toward NATO's next chapter, let's make this commitment on both sides of the Atlantic. Let's rebuild the alliance on respect, on realism, and on shared responsibility. Let's make it leaner, faster, smarter, and, above all, resolute. Because when the free world stands united, it doesn't just deter aggression, it defines the age. America's patience is not infinite, but our belief in liberty is eternal. If Europe remembers that, if we all remember that NATO won't just endure, it will thrive. And that, my friends, is how the free world wins again.